the majority of our life is lived in liminal space.
And there's this in-between space, this liminal space.
This liminality that reveals possibility.
I think we're in a liminal moment, but also in a place of transformation.
I have great affection for the church and a troubled relationship with it.
Just to be alive in time means that we're on the threshold of the future.
That can't be the gospel, because God said to love our neighbors.
We don't know what the future looks like. We have to work it out together.
Keith Giles, welcome back to the Liminal Living Podcast. Is this your third time or your second time?
Oh, I don't know. Probably. Maybe.
I didn't bother to go and check. It just occurred to me as the countdown was going on. I hit record. I'm like, he's been on before, but I think this is your third time.
It might be. I think it is.
Yeah, because we talked Gospel of Thomas.
Yes.
Last time, and then there was a book before that.
Sola Mysterium, maybe, or Sola Deus.
May have been. Well, that's the problem is you've just written so many books.
It's hard to know.
It's like, which one could it be? Like,
right.
You have like 500 books that you authored.
Yeah. Yeah, and we're talking
amazing.
about a book today that just came out, but I have anotgoing to coming out in 2 months. Well,
I know, and I want to talk to you about that one.
It's coming out next month, yeah.
Because I have Mary behind me, and you're
yeah.
You're going to be talking about Mary, and
yeah,
I really want to dive into that topic more because growing up fundamentalist, Mary was, not looked upon grace that great because that's a Catholic thing.
Yes, exactly.
And so then you just don't know what to do with her at all.
Yeah.
So I'm really looking forward to diving into some of that stuff with you. But today we're talking about Romans. You wrote a book with Matthew DiStefano?
Yes, yep.
Reading Romans Right.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I like it.
Yeah.
How did this project get birthed?
Yeah, that's always the first question everybody wants to know. Like, well, how did this happen? Well, Matthew,
that's a better way to put it.
Yeah, Matthew and I have known each other now for I guess about 8 years or so. And, the first time I ever met him was doing this Heretic Happy Hour podcast that we started. And of course, then that continued to the point where now he and I are co-owners of Acquire Publishing and have been doing that together for a couple of years. So, Matt and I work well together, which is really nice. It's when you find someone that you kind of gel with. And we were talking like we usually do. In fact, it might have been on one of our podcasts. We're talking about different books of the Bible that are mistaught and misunderstood. Of course, Revelation is the number one. But we both felt like that the second most misunderstood and mistaught book was Romans. And kind of just dreaming man, someone should write a book like that. And we're like, well, wait a minute, we're authors and we own a publishing company. Why don't we do this?
I know a guy.
So, Matt has written books. He's co-authored books with other people before. I have not. This is the first time I've ever partnered with anybody to write a book. We sat down, we kind of outlined what we wanted to cover in the book and how we wanted to, get our arms around the book of Romans. Mm-hmm. And we each had very similar lists of things that bothered us about the book of Romans and how it's been mistaught and misunderstood. Probably like most of your listeners and probably like you, growing up evangelical, Romans was always kind of held up as the book that was sort of like Paul's epic, manifesto, right? If there's just one book of Paul you could pick, you'd pick most evangelicals would pick Romans. Like, this is it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the book, you have the Romans Road, but it's also a book that is used to justify misogyny, homophobia, the idea that God is full of wrath and creates vessels of wrath for his glory, that he could destroy them and somehow bring himself glory. And it's also a book that used to justify the idea of blind obedience to the state in Romans 13, right? So it's it's used to say all kinds of things that, to be very honest, the Apostle Paul did not intend, and that's not what Romans is about. So we just were like, we've got to set the record straight, write this book to at least present the side of Romans that we never heard growing up, and most people are not going to hear from the pulpit or from their Bible teachers. Hopefully kind of redeem Romans and maybe Paul in the process.
I think that's important work. I don't touch Paul very much I would say this, it's because I have to do so much unlearning before I can actually engage the content. Like if I'm going to teach on a passage, like half of the time is like, well, you've heard it translated this way.
Right.
And then you spell it out that way and everyone's like, yeah, we've heard that. It's like, actually, then it actually means this. And it's like, I don't have enough time to preach messages with Paul in a modern day context because I have to do so much.
Yep.
This is not what it means teaching first.
That's right.
Before we can dive into that one, or at least that's what it feels like. And then I just feel, I guess, a little bit like overwhelmed because I was indoctrinated with Paul growing up fundamentalist.
Yeah.
You know, we didn't really read the teachings of Jesus that much, only when it was talking about lust or wrath.
Yes.
Those are the only two we ever hit.
Yeah. The second coming or hell. Yeah. The Olivet Discourse.
And the second coming was all about wrath. So
yes, of course.
it's coming to get you kind of a thing.
Yep.
And a lot of progressives shy away from Paul's writings because of all these weird modern day interpretations. So what in like this list of stuff, that's where you started. Like, here's what's wrong with Romans. So now we're going to read it right.
Yes.
Show us some of the right ways to read this thing. Like, what's one of your favorites that you just picked out and it's like, that sucks, but this is what it actually means.
Okay. Well, one of the things that, because again, I was thinking about this and I guess Matt and I were both sort of thinking about it separately before we decided to co-write the book. But when I was thinking about like, hey, if I ever write a book on Romans, the thing that I really was most excited about, like shining a light on and explaining, was the structure of the argumentation of what's really going on in Romans. Because I think the number one reason why most Bible teachers misunderstand Romans is because they don't see what he's doing. They don't understand the structure of Paul's argument and what he's actually doing and how he's doing it. So as an example, I guess a couple of years ago, I debated this guy, Dr. James White, on biblical marriage, right? This was in Houston, Texas. It was face-to-face debate in a church and all that. And I made my case, he made his case, you know how debates go. And then there was a little section where he and I could ask each other questions, right? And he kept quoting some stuff from Romans, and I just asked him back again, I said, well, you know, he's got a doctorate in theology, right? I said, well, are you familiar with Paul's argumentation technique in Romans called prosopopoeia? And he looked at me with blank eyes and just said, no, I've never heard of that. And that's when I realized, like, oh my gosh, like, if you don't even know what that is, and you're like, I don't expect the average Christian in the pew to know what prosopopoeia is, right? But I kind of would expect someone who's standing up and saying, I'm an expert on the scriptures and I'm a theologian and I'm going to put doctorate in front of my name and I'm going to stand up and say, Paul means this in Romans, to at least be familiar with this, because it's not brand new. It's been around for probably 50 years, maybe longer. You know, scholars have noticed that Paul is doing this argumentation technique. And so let me explain it first, and then you'll see what I mean.
Tell me what this, I haven't heard of this phrase.
Okay, good. Okay.
And I do have a doctorate.
Okay. Well, see, I think it depends on what schools you go to, right? And who, you know, who's going to show you.
I want to learn.
Yeah.
Teach me.
So here's what's happening in Romans. Paul wants to make a point, right? This is a church he's never visited. He's never been there. And so he's aware of some problems and issues that they're having, and he wants to address these problems and challenges, right, from a distance. So he writes Romans, and that's kind of what he's trying to do. But the way he does it is a very common first century argumentation technique, and we have examples of this from other theologians and philosophers from around the first century, so that he didn't invent this. It was a known way of communicating, right? So he falls back on this prosopopoeia argumentation style, and here's what it is. You are speaking in your voice, so you're saying what it is, the point you want to make, but then you will also switch to the voice of your opponent. And you'll speak in the voice of your opponent and make the points that they would make against you, and then you'll answer those. You'll say, well, but what about this? And then they'll push back, and then you'll say, well, let me answer that. So it's a mock
okay.
debate. It's a mock conversation, essentially, right? And in Romans, what's really fascinating is that this is a conversation between, let's say, Saul of Tarsus, the Pharisee of Pharisees, which again, he has been. He said this. This was my previous life. I was a Pharisee of Pharisees. I kept the law to a fault. I understood all of these things. This is who I was. And then he has this encounter with Christ, and now he's Paul the Apostle, who is now teaching a gospel of grace. And these are the two voices in Romans. If you don't recognize that there are two voices in Romans, if you don't recognize that sometimes Paul is speaking in the voice of who he used to be, the teacher of the law, and then he's countering those arguments with what he now believes about Christ and about the nature of God and grace. If you don't notice that, then you just read it flat, okay? And then you end up with, I always say, all the Theo Bros and the Gospel Coalition and all these Reformed conservative Bible teachers, they love Romans. But the irony is what they love most about Romans is when Paul is speaking in the voice of the teacher of the law.
Yeah.
That's the irony. That's who they quote. That's because they think, I can just flip over to Romans and point to that verse and say, Paul says, and quote that verse and close the book. Well, yeah, he does say that. But if you keep reading, you'll notice that he'll unravel that argument and say, well, but what about this? Or no, because of this and this, right? So if you miss that there's a debate going on, and this happens up until like the end of chapter 11 in Romans, if you're not aware that this is what's happening in this dialogue, then you end up misunderstanding the point Paul's trying to make. And that is probably the number one thing. We even did this in the back of the book. Well, we do it throughout the book as we're explaining this concept, where we'll mark out like Paul says, and then the teacher of the law says, so you can kind of follow the argument, right? But at the back of the book, we just took those sections and put them in the voices. So, and as far as I know, no one's ever done that before. That was one of the things I was dreaming. I was like, it would be great to publish a Bible that when you came to Romans, it would be like bold and italics. So you could just read the two different voices and it would just be plain as day. So we tried to do that in this book as well. And the audiobook we're going to do, by the way, is going to have two different voice actors. So when it's the voice,
brilliant.
yes, so that you can hear it like, okay, this is the voice of the law, the teacher of the law, and now this is the voice of Paul. So it's much easier to follow it.
Wow.
That's just one thing, okay? But I think that's the biggest thing that people misunderstand about Romans.
Wow, and that's just one thing.
Yeah.
That is really interesting because it's like the voice of the law is the one that the fundamentalists like love to adopt and say, look what Paul has said in here.
Yep.
I remember like when I was younger, going through college, I was driving like for an auto parts place, and I would deliver parts to different garages. And so I would listen to like preachers on the radio. It was before podcasts and all that because I'm old. And I would listen to Adrian Rogers, if you remember him. I think he was president of the Southern Baptist.
Oh, yeah.
And so I would just listen to him, and I was like, man, he's really smart. And he did this whole thing on Romans. And the only thing I remember from it was he said, if I was trapped on a desert island and I only got to choose one book of the Bible to keep with me, it's going to be Romans. Yeah. And then he like taught about, I taught on Romans at this church that I was at. They had Wednesday night Bible studies. So I'm like, I'm taking this on. And I used N.T. Wright to help me get through that. It was a different stage in my life.
Yeah.
And I remember I put up the Romans road in front of everyone. I'm like, what's the first thing you notice about this? And everyone looks at it, and about 30 seconds of awkward silence goes by, and then somebody in the back is like, it's out of order.
Exactly.
I'm like, yeah, this is what we do when we don't know. Like, we got to cut it up and repaste it into how we think this should have been. Like, almost like we're correcting
we wish
him.
It was, like how we want it to be.
Yeah, we wish it said this.
Yeah.
So I noticed that.
Yeah.
And so I was like, yes, this is not what this means. And then we like dove into passages and passages. So, well, what was the most difficult passage for you to interpret and why?
Oh, wow. What a great question. So Matt and I kind of split it up, right? And we try to write it in a way that you can't tell so much. We're like, did Keith write this or did Matt write this? But the parts that I was working on that were the most difficult, probably like later on, like Romans 13, not super difficult, but I think it's the one, like you were saying earlier, where you have to make the case for how people always have understood it, right? And then point out why that isn't what Paul is saying. And then go back and say, okay, but now what is he saying, right? So probably that, and then, all through the book. So I guess it's maybe not one passage. I think it's just that whole thing. Like in the beginning, we have to talk about how we've understood salvation, the process, this justification theory, and again, explain all of that, and then show why it's logically inconsistent and how it doesn't match up with what Paul really believes. And then say, well, if it's not that, then what is it, right? And then explain this idea of the gospel of grace. So, yeah, I think those are probably some of the more difficult ones, but at the same time, the most fun, because that was the whole point, right? What we wanted to do was to have an opportunity to reframe these texts that have been misunderstood and mistaught. I'll give people the benefit of the doubt, in good faith, that people probably really do think that is what Paul is saying. But to just point out, like, well, pay attention to what's really going on. Just read through it and see what's happening. So, yeah, I think it was challenging at some points, but overall, it was really actually very rewarding at the end to be able to finally say, "Can you see what Paul really is saying here?" Yeah.
That is cool. I had a professor in my doctorate degree that was friends with Bill Wright, who did the 4 spiritual laws.
Oh, yeah.
Which is kind of tied to the Romans Road.
Yes, it is.
Because it's like, here are the 4 things you have to, acknowledge are true in order to be saved. It's all cognitive stuff. And he said that they would argue about that all the time. The 4 spiritual laws. He's like, no, those are foundational and true and whatnot. But they were also friends. But they would argue about that topic, the Romans Road and the 4 spiritual laws. And I think he was the president of Campus for Christ?
Campus Crusade for Christ.
Yeah, that one.
Yeah.
And well, anyways, he was in the room when he was on his deathbed. And he told all of us that he said he was wrong.
Really?
Yeah. That he said on his deathbed to this guy. It never got published anywhere, but on his deathbed, and I don't want to name drop my professor.
Okay.
People would know him. I'll tell you later.
Okay.
But on his deathbed, he told my professor, I don't think I was quite right with this stuff. I think you were onto something.
Wow.
But at that point, it's like, you've built this entire structure built on 4 laws that you said were foundational.
Yep. And people are still living by it right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's like, when you build something that's so massive, then you can't critique it anymore. And it was like, I built it. What am I going to do with this?
Yes. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Were there any surprises that you found in your research? Like, totally didn't see that coming kind of a surprise? Like, whoa, I had no idea this was going to be in here.
No, I don't think so. And I don't want to say that like arrogant or anything. Oh, I knew it all. But no, there wasn't anything, I guess, it's sort of surprising, I guess. At the end of Romans, because frankly, before we sat down to write the book, the parts of Romans that I knew in my head I wanted to address was like the difference between Romans 1, which is sort of the clobber passages for, the LGBTQ community, and then chapter 2. So I want to talk about that. I wanted to talk about Paul's one thing that's totally missed, which is that by the end of Romans chapter 11, Paul has made his main point, which is that God's plan is to save everyone. Because I felt like we really missed that one. And then, of course, I wanted I got to talk about Romans 13 and the allegiance to the state and all that kind of stuff. But beyond 13, I was kind of fuzzy. Like, I know there's chapters after that. I think it's like there's 2 or 3 chapters, but I couldn't remember, just before I sat down to write the book, I was kind of like, I know there's other stuff after that, but I couldn't really remember. But then sitting down to go through it, and we went through it chapter by chapter, I was kind of like, oh, wow, there's some really great stuff after Romans 13. Things about Paul's priority of love in the body of Christ. There's I guess it was a very common debate of the day, because he deals with it in 1 Corinthians, and he deals it, so the church in Corinth was struggling with it, and the church in Rome was also struggling with it, which is within the body of Christ, there were some believers who were convinced it was a horrible sin to eat meat sacrificed to idols, and others who thought, doesn't matter, they're not real anyway, right? They're not real gods. And so Paul addresses these, really fundamental things. Like, you can see this could tear the church apart, like, how can I sit down with somebody who would do something as horrible as eat meat sacrificed to these pagan gods? And what I found fascinating was that the way Paul handles that is not to say these guys are right and those guys are wrong, right? Shut up and get in line. Do what I say. Instead, he said, you know what? Let everyone be convinced in their own mind and love each other. Like, oh, wow, we don't have to have agreement to have unity. That's really interesting, because Paul definitely wants unity. He doesn't want that church to rip apart. But what he reminds them of is that, hey, you all belong to Christ, and, put Jesus back in the center of it. And who cares about this other stuff, right? Like, ultimately, it doesn't really matter as long as you love each other. That was really cool. So that was really cool to see the way Paul handled that. And then, of course, at the very end, the way he honors women. Because this is also the end of Romans is the famous passage where Paul identifies a female apostle, Junia, and names many other women who are also, in the roles of what we would call bishops or pastors or deacons or evangelists or, so, just seeing that as well. Again, when you realized how much conservative evangelicals love the book of Romans, you notice how they kind of cherry pick. Yes. We don't like that part. We don't really emphasize that part, but we'll emphasize these other parts, that we do like, the wrathful parts. So yeah, those are kind of interesting.
Nice. Well, you kind of dropped the clobber passage in chapter 1, probably the most well-known and quoted nowadays. Yeah. How did you take that passage on? What did you find?
Yeah. And I've written on this before. I've written a few blog posts about this. And of course, Matthew is also, I think most people who listen to the podcast know this, that Matthew is bisexual. So he, of course, has written about this as well and has opinions on this. Well, the way we approached it was honestly just the way Paul approaches it. Number one, if you just understand again that when Paul wrote this, there was no chapter breaks or verse breaks, right? This was one long letter. And in fact, the way it was presented to the church in Rome after he wrote it, right, he hands it to Phoebe, a woman. She hand delivers it to that church, and then she stands up and reads it out loud to them. So there's no breaks, okay? And it's almost kind of acted out. And again, he's writing to a church he doesn't know. He's never visited them. But again, he knows they've got some problems that he wants to address. So chapter 1 is really, Paul starts out kind of building them up. Not just building them up. How do I want to say it? He starts off winding them up. That's what I want to say. He's winding them up. And you can almost be a fly on the wall. Like, I wish you could be a fly on the wall. Like, here's Phoebe. She stands up. She starts reading chapter 1. And you can probably see most of the people in the congregation, like, responding to the kind of ire and judgment that Paul is touching on, right? Those pagans, they do these awful things. They are so disgusting. Oh, they're horrible. They're awful. Those people over there. He's building this really strong us and them, sentiment. And that's a weird way to start your letter. But he's getting them all excited and angry. and judgmental and yes, it's us against them and we're the righteous ones and those are the horrible, evil, disgusting people who do these awful, horrible things. And then again, there's no break. There's no chapter 2. You just go from all of that to, and if you condemn those people, you're also condemning yourself because you're also people who break the law just as much as they do. So like there's this big gotcha, right? He ramps them up, he winds them up, he sets them up. They're just like, they're filled with this righteous indignation against those people. And then he goes, but are you any better? Right? All this anger you have right now, judging these people, where's your love for these people? Right? Where's your compassion for them? Right? And it's like a big, oh crap. He just put his finger on something that every single one of those people in the church in Rome had to struggle with, right? Like, oh, wait a minute. And now he's got their attention, right? Now he can sort of like, let's talk about this. Let's talk about love. Let's talk about grace. Let's talk about the character and nature of God from now a different perspective, right? And I think it also sets up this prosopopoeia thing, right? So when it transitions in what we call chapter 2 to this, well, hey, wait a minute. So if you're judging these people and you don't like these people and you kind of hate these people, but you're guilty of the same thing, right? It's very similar to what Jesus does in the Sermon on the Mount, right? He says, we don't want to be like those pagans. Yeah, we don't like those guys. They only love people that love them in return. Oh, they're so selfish. They're so self-centered. Yeah, we don't want to be like them, do we? Oh, no, we don't want to be like them. You know what we're going to do? We're going to be better than them. We're going to love people even who hate us like those pagans.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
nice.
Wait a minute. Right? So it's a very similar kind of thing. But it also sets up these two voices. Like, okay, sometimes Paul is talking to us, but it's not really him. Right? He's touching on something else. And then after that, he's going to say something about that. Okay. So he's setting up this back and forth kind of dialogue thing. And so, I think that's just really, really fascinating to see that. And also just to know, again, that a woman is standing up in front of everybody and reading this is also something that most of the Theo bros don't want to talk about.
We don't want to go there.
Yeah. How did Romans even get delivered? Like, well, by a woman who stood up and talked for probably over an hour.
Yeah. That's crazy. So it's almost like a sucker punch to them. Like, he gets them all wound up. And it reminds me of that passage from, I think it was chapter 7, where he's talking about, Jesus waited till sin was at its climax and then dealt with it on the cross, kind of a thing. Almost like I have to draw all the evil out to its fullest extent in order to address it.
Exactly. Yes.
So like the crucifixion moment is not me taking care of your sins because you're such a dirty person, but shining this huge light on the fact that humans are, these humans were evil enough to condemn God for blasphemy. And it's like,
imagine.
Whoa, holy smokes. Yeah. And I'd never thought to apply that perspective to chapter 1.
Yeah.
I saw chapter 2's follow-up was like, oh, and such were you.
Yes.
Kind of a thing. But I never thought that it was kind of like that switcheroo sucker punch going on here. That's brilliant.
Yeah. So the point then is like, it's not even really, we go into much more detail as well, because the other thing going on in Romans, when he is talking about those pagans and their sexual practices when they're worshiping idols and all that kind of stuff, we do point out that, and we quote a whole lot of like really conservative scholars, right? Like Matthew Henry, who wrote the commentaries. Matthew Henry and other Catholic theologians who all agreed that what Paul is talking about in Romans chapter 1 is pagan idol worship. He's not talking about what we would consider homosexuality today, which is loving, committed relationships between two people. That's not what he's talking about. And I make the point, I've been trying to make this point for the longest time when it comes to Romans chapter 1, that if you could read it, like if you went back and reread Romans chapter 1, and when he was describing the sexual activity that the pagans used to worship their false gods, if that sexual activity was heterosexual, right? It was men and women fornicating in the temple to worship Diana or Apollo, whoever it was, right? Paul's point would be the same, right? Number one, because the point is just that they do these horrible things and worshiping these false gods, right? That's the only point he's trying to make. And if that is what the example that he used in Romans chapter 1, would anybody read that and come away with the conclusion, oh, therefore God hates heterosexual sex. God hates it when men and women have sex. Because look, right there in Romans, he talked about how horrible it was. No, you would get it. Like, no, he's not against that particular kind of sexual activity. He's against fornication, in public in these temples used to worship these false gods. That's what he's upset about. And we only apply the condemnation to the type of sex that is being described, because if we're heterosexual, that we don't like that. We find that disgusting. Which may be why he chose that, because again, he's trying to point out some things in the hearts and minds of the people he's speaking to. But anyway, we tried to cover all those different bases because we feel like there's a lot more going on in Romans chapter 1 than most people notice.
Yeah, that's alone worth the price of the book right there.
Yeah. I hope so, yes.
Yeah. Well, you did a co-writing thing for the very first time. What kind of challenges did you come up against with co-writing?
Yeah, I got to say, it was wonderful. It was really enjoyable. We only had a couple of spots. I'm trying to remember. There was one thing that Matthew had written, because we took turns. So like we kind of broke it up. So he would write his section and then send it to me, and I would read through it and make suggestions and edits and changes. And then same thing, I would write mine and I would send it to him, and he would send it back to me with some edits and changes. And the only significant change that I made for the things that Matthew had written was, and if you know Matt, you'll know that this is kind of like par for the course. So, we're writing this kind of theological book about Romans and all these kind of things. And he threw in this reference to Kendrick Lamar, who is his favorite rapper, right? And I was like, yeah, dude, I don't think we need that in here. I don't think that's going to help us, right? I don't think our audience is really going to appreciate that. I said, plus, remember, the plan was we're trying to write this in a way that people wouldn't know who wrote what. And they're going to know that that's you, because they all know you're a huge Kendrick Lamar fan. So he always said, okay, he took that part out. He conceded. That for me, the thing that he took out was I wrote some of the sections about the prosopopoeia, the back and forth argumentation. And I didn't really use, like Douglas Campbell is somebody who's a scholar who's written about this and is like over 1,000 page, theological books about Romans. And so Douglas Campbell points out the prosopopoeia dialogue. Michael Hardin is also someone who does this. And but when I was going through just the first draft of those sections and trying to say, like, okay, this is Paul and this is the teacher of the law, I didn't reference any of those. I tried to just like, this is to me the voice of Paul, and this is to me the voice of the teacher of the law, right? So I just kind of wrote it and broke it out in the ways that made sense to me. And there was one section that Matthew caught. He said, well, I see what you're saying. He said, but just so you know, Douglas Campbell says it's the other voice. Like he doesn't agree. You're disagreeing with Douglas Campbell that this should be Paul instead of the teacher of the law. So I went and looked at it again, and I was kind of like, okay, look, I'm not going to argue with Douglas Campbell on this point. I will concede that. Let him have that one. But otherwise, yeah, there were no major arguments. We didn't have any major disagreements.
No fist fights?
Yeah, no. It was really, really good. And I want to say, like, man, I would write another one with him because for me, it was like, I only had to write half of a book, For me to write half of a book and have a finished product at the end that I'm proud of is really fun. That's really nice. So we probably will do another one. We're considering this to be a Bible series. So we're kicking it off ourselves with Romans. He and I want to probably do Galatians. And then I know I want to do one on Hebrews. I'll probably do that by myself. Mm-hmm. And he's talked about doing Genesis, or at least the major parts of Genesis. But anyway, we'll probably do some co-writing again in the future, because it really was a lot of fun and very enjoyable process, and we're very happy with the way it turned out.
Yeah. I attempted to do Hebrews. We follow the liturgical calendar.
Yeah.
And I've just been sticking with the gospel passage and teaching on that. And there's just always enough there. And then I thought, I've been doing that for 5 years now. I'm going to divert out. And we did James. And I was like, oh, that was so good. Like, this is just Sermon on the Mount commentary.
It is. It actually is. And when you realize that that's what's happening in James, it makes James even better. I
know. I loved it. And I was like, I can do this. And then I jumped into Hebrews because that was next on the liturgical calendar.
Yeah.
I dive bombed that one.
Oh yeah. It's tough.
It was so thick. It was so cerebral. It was so otherworldly. I struggled to land the plane every week. I'm like, and this means in the heavenly places. I don't know.
Yeah, no. See, that's why to me, Hebrews is similar to Romans, right? I feel like every time I see someone quoting from Hebrews to prove something, they're missing the point. That if they actually would go back and look at it and read the sections before that verse and the sections after that verse, they would realize that that little verse that they pulled out that they think is saying X is actually saying Y. And that's one of the reasons I want to go and do Hebrews. And probably like you, it may not be as easy as I think, because I haven't gotten deep into like every single chapter. But when it comes to this, the main thing that people get out of Hebrews usually is, the thing like, without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sins, right? Mm-hmm. So most of the time we're reading Hebrews as an affirmation of the idea that God's salvation plan does involve blood sacrifice. Like, that's just, it says right there in Hebrews. But I think that Hebrews is actually teaching the exact opposite of that. And I really want to show that, because, we miss the other verses where Jesus says to the Father, blood and sacrifice you did not require, but a body you prepared for me. Okay, so he's juxtaposing these two things. There is, in a sense, this idea of Jesus in his body, right, doing something for the salvation side. But in the context, in the same sentence of him saying, but you didn't want blood sacrifice, and that's not what you required. So it's begging us to understand it in a different way. And I just feel like, as far as I know, I need to start doing the research, I guess. I want to try to find other scholars. I'm sure I'm not the only one that noticed this, right? But
I got one for you.
Okay, good.
Chris Green,
okay,
Dr. Chris Green,
okay,
he did some work on the mimetic theory in there.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a nonviolent reading of, I'll send you some podcasts that he talked through the entire book in a 2-hour podcast.
Oh my gosh,
it was
yes,
amazing.
Please send me that.
Okay. I'll that was on the Inverse podcast years ago too.
Yeah.
That's a great podcast. I want to have those guys on here one day.
Yeah, so that's one of the ones. It won't be my next book, but maybe in a year or two.
I can see that you're hungry to dive into that one.
Yeah, but I have other things that I want to have to do first. So I will put it on the board. I've got a little whiteboard over here. I'll put it on the board, and I will get to that eventually. I really do want to do that. I just have to finish up this quantum Bible series I'm doing first.
Yeah, you got the Gospel of Mary coming up.
Yeah.
But so who's going to critique this book the most, and what will they say? And what is your response?
Oh, that's a great question. In fact, that's part of our marketing for this book, part of our plan. We have a book launch team we put together, almost like 50 people. And one of the things we asked them to do was to go on the websites and the YouTube channels of people like Alyssa Childers and Mike Winger and Sean McDowell, and go over to the Gospel Coalition and, be nice. We're not asking them to be obnoxious, but to mention oh my gosh, I've read this book, Reading Romans Right, and it seems to contradict what you're saying. And what's your response? We desperately want those responses. I would love a debate. I would love to read a review on the Gospel Coalition by someone who read the book and went through point by point to all the points we're making and gave us some kind of a response. That's what I want. I want the dialogue, right? this is always the way I've approached anything theological or anything about the Bible, is I don't really care if at the end of the day you land where I land and you agree with my conclusion, but at least listen to the argument, at least be aware of what I'm pointing out to you, right? Then at least you're making an informed decision. You can say, yeah, I'm aware of prosopopoeia, but I don't agree with it because of something, right? Or yes, I'm aware that Paul says this here and makes a strong case for universal reconciliation at the end of chapter 11. But I still believe in, you know what I mean? Like, but at least you know, you can see it, you're aware of it, right? It's more of like, again, I just want people to think and to listen. So my how are they going to respond? My fear is that they won't respond at all. That's my concern, right? The worst thing would be to be ignored. I'm hoping that someone will respond to us. In fact, our best hope might be Sean McDowell, because the foreword to this book was written by Brandon Robertson. And Brandon Robertson has a couple of times, at least 2 times that I'm aware of, maybe more, has actually been on Sean McDowell's show. And they've had, because they don't agree on many things, right? And so Sean has been one of the few people in that camp who's willing to actually get on camera and talk to people that don't agree with his theology. Everybody else I mentioned, I've yet to see it. So, so our hope is that maybe through Brandon, we can at least get Sean McDowell to address some of the things we're saying in the book. I mean, I'm assuming they will push back on the homosexuality on chapter 1. I'm assuming they'll push back on Romans 13 and allegiance to the state. They will probably definitely push back on Junia as a female apostle and all the women that Paul honors at the end of Romans. I really don't know about the prosopopoeia because, like I said, I think a lot of them are not familiar with this and have never heard of this before. And that's what I'd be the most curious to hear their response to.
Well, you've dropped Romans 13 a couple of times, and that's a passage that seems to be pulled out when Republicans are in power and then put away when Democrats are in power.
Yes.
How did you handle that passage, and what did you find?
Yeah. Well, what I try to point out is Romans 12. Again, you have to understand the flow and the context of what Paul's doing in Romans. Everything up to the end of chapter 11, Paul is trying to make a case, and he makes his case and does his little end zone dance at the end of chapter 11, celebrating that he's made his point, that God has consigned everyone to disobedience so that God can show mercy to everyone, meaning everyone will be saved. And so he does, who can know the mind of God, how high and wide and deep, and all these amazing things, how awesome God is. Then in 12, he answers the question I get all the time, which is, hey, if everyone's going to be saved, then why be a Christian, right? That's why Romans chapter 12 is, therefore, in view of God's great mercy to everyone, how then should we live? Well, and so then he explains that's what Romans 12 is saying. And Romans 12 is addressed specifically to the church, right? Like, here's how you should react and respond to this idea that God's intention is to show mercy to everyone and that everyone will be saved. And here's how you should behave. And then in 13, again, there's a pivot. And this is what I think most are missing. They think that Romans 13 is still talking to the church. And Paul is now saying, he's still talking to the church, but he's saying, here's how you should relate to the state. All right. Like, we're not going to be rebels, and we're not going to start an insurrection. We're not going to try to overthrow the government, right? That's not what we're here to do, right? We're going to still follow this path of Jesus. We're going to love our enemies. We're going to bless them, all these kind of things. And so we're not going to be these sort of revolutionaries. And so therefore, we're going to submit to the governing authorities. But it's a recognition that this is where I think a lot of Christians get Romans 13 wrong. They think that what Paul is suggesting, is that somehow Christians have the authority to wield the sword, right? And Paul's point is, no, that's the state. That's not you, okay? That's the people that don't get it, that are not in Christ, that don't understand the way of Christ. Like Romans 12 is what you should be doing, right? Romans 13 is how we would relate to the state. But those two things, you don't cross those streams. You as a Christian are not going to be the one wielding the sword. And so again, framing it also from the understanding that, Paul at the end of his life was writing from prison and was in prison for defying the state. And during the time of like the reign of Nero, which was the most evil, emperor in the Roman Empire, that when he says things like submit to the state when they're doing good, right? Recognizing that sometimes they won't. So, I think we have to read it from this, again, back up and understand the context, what's really going on. And ultimately, it's not our job to punish the state, or punish leaders, or punish our oppressors if we feel like they're doing wrong, right? He says, let God be the one to deal with that. Our job is to love them. I think, again, that's the main point of what he's trying to say there. It's not anything about have blind allegiance to the state, no matter what they do. And as you said, you only say that when it's your side that's in power, but you're not willing to submit to them if it's not your side and you don't like what they're doing. But again, if that's your reaction, then you're missing totally what Paul is saying. He's saying to really mainly submit when you don't agree, when they're not on your side, right? That's the challenge for us to work out.
How would you then convert that in like today? I mean, the Roman Empire was pretty bad.
Pretty brutal, yeah.
But then now we're experiencing like an authoritarian regime.
Yes.
How would you kind of use this passage in a modern day political context if you're going to apply the perspectives that Paul is saying to our modern day? How would you use this passage today?
Yeah, it's really hard, isn't it?
It is.
We're in a challenging spot right now, and I'm constantly struggling personally with, like, even beyond Romans 13, what Paul is saying in Romans 13. I personally struggle with another idea, which is the idea that we're all connected, right? This idea of oneness and connection with the divine, and with we have a shared divinity and a shared humanity. And to say, like, wow, really? I have to look at someone like Trump and most people surrounding him and see them as equally connected to God as I am, equally loved as I am. This is really hard, There are no easy answers to this kind of thing. I think the best we can do is, what Paul is appealing to is that it's not our job, it's not our place to respond with rage or anger or violence, right? That's not going to be the way we respond. Our response has to be the same as Christ. We have to love them, serve them, and then what does that mean, right? Practically, I think that the way I personally have been trying to wrestle through it is to really just take one person at a time, because I think it's very difficult to apply these things to nebulous powers or governments or, forces. You can't interact with governments or laws or forces like that, right? Our struggle is usually on the individual level, our direct struggle, like a family member, a friend, a coworker who has these views that we find so difficult and violent and destructive. Then it's about engaging that person one-on-one, giving them humanity, giving them grace, learning to listen to them, asking a lot of questions, not being judgmental. And again, so that means it's something that will not be a one and done, like in one conversation or one interaction. It's going to be a long-term relationship with people like this who we disagree with very strongly. And loving them whether they change their mind or not. And hoping, though, in the process of showing them grace and showing them love and listening to them even when we don't agree with them, that we're making room for the Spirit of God and for the grace of God to create some kind of transformation in them, right? Mm-hmm. That maybe they can eventually see what we're seeing and understand what we understand, but not in a way that's just power over, top down. We can't force them to do that, right? I think that's really what Paul is saying in Romans 13. It's not this power over thing. That's the state. That's what they do, right? They wield the sword. Well, we don't. We carry the cross. And what the cross does is it kind of kills us, right? It's dying to ourself and that ego part of us, right? So that's the way through this. Somehow, that's the path through this. It's the way of the cross, not the way of the sword.
Oh, wow. Yeah. And it is hard to really apply these things to modern context because there's so much difference between Roman government, American government, Roman people, our people.
Yeah.
And then there's so much difference between the early Christian church, like Tertullian, he would say Christians are not allowed to serve in the military.
Right. Oh, yeah, exactly.
Because we don't kill.
That's right.
It's like, that's changed.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So,
it's a complete flip.
It was a complete flip, and now it's Christian nationalism. There's another passage, Romans, I believe, 7, where Paul is getting into this almost like an argument with himself about the things I want to do, I don't do, and the things I don't want to do. Yeah. And the fundamentalist application of this is, see, even Paul struggled with addictions and sins and stuff. Yeah. But if you just pray through it, you can stay clean and good. How did you handle that portion? Where'd you go with that? Yeah, well, because I think that's, again, another misunderstood passage where yes, I've always heard that passage taught. Oh, gosh, it was reminding me of a conference I was at once. Me and this other guy, his name is Dan Naughty, great guy, love him. He and I it was like a little house church conference we were doing. And he was trying to he went to that passage in Romans, exactly when you're talking about, right? The good that I want to do, I don't do, and the evil I don't want to do, that's what I do. And oh, wretched man that I am, And again, that what I call worm theology, that there's nothing good in me and I'm hopeless and helpless and I'm just this, I can never do anything good and there's nothing good in me whatsoever and all that kind of stuff, right? And again, that's one of those things where we are so indoctrinated by that. It's very, very difficult to break that concept in people's heads. We just embrace it, right? And so Dan was he and I had already talked about this, so I knew this was coming. And I'm sitting in the back, and he's up there talking, and he was trying to make this point, like, yes, it says that, but again, keep reading. And he says, so he asked the rhetorical question, what can save me? What hope do I have? I'm in this condition, this helpless condition. And then he says, but the grace of God, right? It's Christ in me, right? That's the answer. So he answers the dilemma by saying that Christ in me empowers me to live this good life, to do the righteous things. I'm not hopeless. I'm not helpless. I'm not trapped in this loop where I cannot not escape my intense evil and my worminess, my wretchedness. And they did not get it. They couldn't get it at the Q. So he made I thought he did a wonderful job. I thought, okay, he's getting it. Like, they're getting it. He's doing a great job. And at the end, there was a Q&A, and someone was talking about, there's apparently some song called Dead Alive, and they all started singing it. And it's about how we're dead because we're hopeless and worthless, but we're alive in Christ, but we're dead. And they wanted both, right? They wanted it to be both. They wanted it to be this paradox or something. Like, yes, we're awful, horrible wretches who have no hope of doing anything good ever and ever, but Christ is also alive in us. Like, no, Paul's not trying to make them both true. He's trying to say, if you feel this way, if you think this way, here's the door, here's the way out, here's the solution, here's the antidote. And they just couldn't get it, I think, again, we get addicted to this idea that I'm a wretch, I'm a worm, there's nothing good in me. And we're missing, again, what Paul is trying to say is that that's not reality. The reality is you are alive in Christ. You have the mind of Christ. You can know these things, right? You can know Christ. You can do these good things. And that's the whole point. Jesus says this, emphasizes this all the time, right? I'm the vine, you're the branches. If you abide in me and I abide in you,
right? And you'll even do greater things than me. That's what is said, not this, oh, woe is me. I'm worthless and hopeless. I cannot do anything. But again, if you get stuck on it and you can't see it, it's very difficult to change people's minds about that way of thinking.
Yeah. We read it with like this sin management
Yes.
Viewpoint with like an unhealthy addiction to feeling shame and guilt.
Yes.
Like if you look at all of our worship songs that
Yes.
are like in the top 100, like how many of them are like, I am poor and I am dead and I am wretched and I am horrible.
And I don't
you take
deserve
my
your
shame
love. And yeah.
Yeah, there's all this like, we're just so addicted to like shaming ourselves so that God can come in and like save us and redeem us. And it's just this weird cycle I've been noticing more in like modern worship songs.
Yeah.
Like, I don't think that's psychologically healthy.
Oh, and I think it's very unhealthy. Yeah. I think it also then sets up a God who's kind of cruel. And like if Brad Jerzak pointed this out one time, that people will go and sit under that kind of teaching, and then come out of a sermon like that, and they'll say, well, man, the pastor really kicked my butt, and it's like, thank you, sir. Can I have another? It was so great. And he said, it's very sadomasochistic, right? It's like this sadomasochistic spirituality and faith, which is really, that's not what Jesus is about. And I think one of the people, again, before I turned the corner on this kind of teaching, when I used to, because I used to agree with that thing. I used to think that was what you were supposed to do, right? I remember, like, I used to love Francis Chan. I think Francis Chan is the king of this kind of stuff, right? Yeah. He's the master of this kind of teaching. I don't think I've ever heard a sermon where he doesn't take a long detour down this whole way of thinking. And so at the end of it, you do kind of feel like crap. And you're like, yeah, man, I am worthless and hopeless and I'm an awful person. Thank you. Do it again. That was so good. Like, why? Why do I think that was so good? It was actually kind of cruel.
There's the emotional roller coaster of handing you a spiritual problem and then dispensing the solution to you so that you feel good in the moment.
That's right.
And it's like drug dealing.
Yes, I have to give you this really bad news first, and then, look, but like I'm going to solve the problem. Yeah.
I have solved the problem for you.
That I created.
That I created. Yes. Yeah, that I'm trying. I've been on a very long journey to like unfundamentalize my brain and get that cultic patterns of thinking out of there. Yeah. I've been like journeying out, but then it's like it's just been coded in my brain so much that I'm still I still have.
It's hard. It's really hard
to
break
sneaks up
that.
on me every now and then.
It's an indoctrination.
So I think the work that you're doing is really important, especially with a book like Romans. So I just want to thank you for writing it and putting it out there. Where do you want to send folks to grab it?
It is on Amazon, and you can get it on Kindle or paperback. And like I said, the audiobook is in process right now. And I'm excited about it because we've never done anything like this before. So the audiobook, I'm very excited about to get the back and forth voices and stuff. Or you can honestly, or if people want a signed copy, I have signed copies. If they want to send me an email or something, and you live in the United States, if you're U.S. only, happy to send you a signed copy.
Nice. Awesome. Well, hey, thanks for jumping on the show and talking Romans. I really enjoyed it. It's going to be good to dive into that book.
Thanks so much, Tom. Yeah, it was fun.